Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension. Self.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to a podcast not only of sound, but also of mind. It's Time to Rewind is a podcast that takes a journey into the wondrous land of time loops, whose boundaries are that of imagination. Each episode, my guest and I explore these time loops, one loop at a time. This season, I'm trapped in the Twilight Zone. And this is my third and final stop at 1963's Season 4, Episode 6, Death Ship. My guest today is Dave Smith from Sequel Harder. How are you doing today?
Great. Good to be here. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. It's, this is my third stop on Death Ship, and I'm really curious to see how this goes.
That you're tired of finding yourself as a dead body.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned this already in in my second stop here, but this is an episode that's really grown on me the more that I've watched it. I didn't watch it again today, but I watched it like twice just a few days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot to this episode, and I believe you said you hadn't seen this episode before.
I had not seen this one before. I did watch a fair amount of Twilight Zone, but this one I didn't see.
All right, so what is your history with the Twilight Zone? Where did that start?
Yeah, so I was an '80s kid, and I watched. I guess there was a version of the Twilight Zone on in the '80s, but also the reruns of the originals. I would watch like Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side, Amazing Stories. All of those anthology, creepy, weird sci-fi things. I loved it.
Yeah, I was a huge Tales from the Crypt. Like that was my entry into like anthology sci-fi horror stuff.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it was like the Fox episodes that aired at like 10 o'clock at night on Saturday or Sunday, I think. And they edited out all the nudity but none of the gore.
Yeah, and then there was that Freddy's Nightmares.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that? Yeah, so it was
I don't think I watched that, but I was aware of it.
Yeah, because I think it had Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, but he was more like a crypt keeper. He just kind of introduced the episode that was just about whatever it was about. And
the one that I remember that probably nobody else has heard of is the Nightmare Cafe, which also it had Robert Englund in it, but he wasn't Freddy.
Mm.
And that was like just a weird little. It was like an anthology series, but it also had interconnect it had three characters that were present throughout the entire series, and they had kind of their own storyline, but each episode was also its own individual story about people that came into the Nightmare Cafe, and then they had their story.
Right. Oh, that sounds vaguely familiar. But I love those things. I'm just thinking about some of the Freddy's Nightmares ones. There was an episode and it was always these very like, monkey's paw type of deals. Like this guy was having, making love to a girl that he really, really wanted to make love to. And she's like, "Oh, do you love me?" And he had to tell her he loved her or they wouldn't go any further. And then they woke up the next morning and they were joined at the genitals. It was very sort of Cronenberg body horror stuff going on.
Yeah, I think it's, you mentioned the monkey's paw, and it reminds me, just recently on Disney Plus, they released a Lego Star Wars Tales of Terror, and they have the Wookiee's Paw is one of the short stories on.
Nice.
It's like, a handful of short, Lego, very family friendly Star Wars themed Halloween tales, and one of them was the Wookiee's Paw. They also have a Lost Boys homage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, with Kylo Ren. and in the Michael
Of
role.
course. Of course. Just yeah, I love these Twilight Zone stories. One of my favorite, and it's like they always had the twist ending, right? And so one of my favorites was the Burgess Meredith one, where the whole world gets destroyed, but then he's like, oh great, I can spend all my time reading books now, and then he breaks his glasses.
Somebody just randomly referenced that on Twitter, and they're like, most Twilight Zone have some sort of message, and this one is just like, you effing nerd.
Yeah, totally. The other one that I thought it really had a big impact on me was the aliens showed up and they're like, hey, you guys, all you humans are doing all these petty squabbles. This is stupid. Knock it off. Right. And so all the heads of the governments from around the world get together, and within 24 hours, they have achieved world peace. And they come back to the aliens and like, hey, we settled all our differences. We've created peace on Earth. And the aliens are like, oh, that's not what we meant. We want you to be better at making war. You were just so bad at it before.
Yeah, I don't remember that episode. It's been a while since I've seen much of Twilight Zone. Like I'm familiar with a lot of the most famous episodes, and I think I'm pretty sure I saw like the movie, not when it came out, but it's like on home video at some point. But all of that's been many years. But I have enjoyed all the episodes that I've rewatched here for this season. They've all been pretty interesting, and I'm not sure. I almost would say that this one's my favorite right now, but that's just because it's the one that I've watched the most recently.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you're doing a whole season based on time loop episodes. Like, I guess there's enough to do a whole season. Like, how many Twilight Zone episodes deal with time loops?
There's actually fewer than I thought there would have been.
Oh.
There's, let's see, there's 5. Well, 6, but 2 of them are technically the same episode.
Interesting. So that kind of brings up, and I'm sure you've touched on this before, but the movies, like Palm Springs, where we catch up with him after he's been in the time loop forever, much like Groundhog Day, which I thought was a fantastic movie. But both of those movies.
I'm excited to see a lot more because I'm coming to this show. I've seen a fair amount of time loop movies. I think I've seen more time loop TV episodes than I have movies, but I haven't really dived in and started seeking out the ones that I haven't seen yet. I'm waiting until I decide to do them as a season for the show. So like I haven't seen Palm Springs, I haven't seen Source Code. I think those are the 2 biggest ones that people bring up a lot that I haven't seen yet, and I'm looking forward to catching up with those and covering them on a future season.
Nice. Have you seen Time Crimes?
I have not, but take a look at that. I have a podcast friend that's he swears by that movie. That's like one of his favorite time travel movies.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
But I suppose we should actually talk about the actual episode.
Yeah, we could.
So this is the first time that you've seen it, so I'm going to go ahead and let you take the wheel because I've talked about this episode twice already. So I'm curious what things you'll point out as somebody that's seen it just for the first time.
Okay, sure. So the first thing I noticed was that Spaceship E-89 has a string holding it.
It's funny. I've watched this several, I think 4 or 5 times, and I didn't pick up on that. I mean, it's one of those things where, this is an old movie. It's got the spaceship from Forbidden Planet, and, it's relatively low budget and, old time special effects, but that's something that I don't know, maybe I just expected it to be there, so I didn't even look for it.
Yeah, it was just kind of the first thing. Well, okay, so full disclosure, I work in the film industry. I'm a cinematographer, so I tend to watch when I watch TV or movies. I watch it on two levels at once, just enjoying the story and also being very highly critical of the technique and the technology going into it.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of park my brain for this one because it's 1963, it's television, the thing looks like it's somebody's backyard with a couple of fake computers thrown in. It's fine.
Yeah, and it does have a few moments of special effects, which I haven't actually talked about. So I'm curious to get into that a little bit and see them from your perspective, because they were good special effects for the time, but of course that you see the strings literally, quite literally, in some moments.
Yeah. Jack Klugman as the captain is, to me, a very interesting choice. I watched The Odd Couple for years. Like I'm very familiar with his work, but to see him as the hard-nosed military, space what do they call them? The Interplanetary Administration Rocket Bureau, which I love. I love this stuff. And the fact that they are using the flying saucer from Forbidden Planet.
Forbidden Planet, yeah.
I love the fact that we were so, somebody back in the 40s or 50s thought they saw, a flying saucer, and that became the ship. And then the creators of this episode thought that in the future, that's the kind of ship we would make to go into space, even though in the early 60s, we were making rockets to go into space, not flying saucers. So
this was 63, so this was still at the relatively early stage of the actual space program, but they did have rockets at this point, and they just went on the cheaper budget because they already had the spaceship from Forbidden Planets, and I believe that the fourth season was a shorter season, even though it's the only season with hour-long episodes instead of the half-hour episodes. But I believe I read that they did have at least a slightly reduced budget compared to earlier seasons.
I mean, that makes sense, and it shows up, and so it was like I'm trying not to laugh at all the silly, And this is like, what was it? It's like 5 years before even Star Trek came out, so it's very primitive. So it's fine. I give it all a pass because it is what it is, right? But Jack Klugman, getting back to that, having him be this hard-nosed space captain, and I don't see him as that character. He's Oscar Madison from The Odd Couple. He's a comic actor, or maybe he's a dramatic actor too, but he's not a military guy to me. So just him with his New York accent and mean, and that was the thing. His character was so there was all this weird instant drama between him and the two other guys. As soon as something happened, they're like, "Hey, we should do this." Nope, we're not doing that.
Yeah, he's extremely overbearing, and later on in an interview, he actually said that this was one of his least favorite roles. I think because of his character's personality, because it's such a strong personality, but it's also a very negative personality.
Yeah, he doesn't.
He's almost a villain, practically, in this episode, because especially whenever we get to the end and you find out that it's through his force of will that is basically trapping the other two crewmates with him in this time loop afterlife purgatory.
Yeah, and that was weird. I actually had to go look it up, what the ending meant, and rewatch the last few minutes because I wasn't quite clear at how it ended.
The Jack Klugman's Captain Ross, he is, he just has such this force of will, and that he is not accepting his own death. And so because he doesn't accept his own death, he's causing him in the afterlife to, replay the cause of it. And because he wants to go over it again to see what he did wrong and to see if he can do it right the next time. And it's he's such a powerful character that he brings in his two crewmates. They're trying to go off into their own afterlives and be with their families. And move on and into the afterlife, go into the light. And he's like, no, I need a crew. You're staying with me.
Yeah, which is a really kind of interesting way to take this. I wasn't expecting that. I was, when they land on the planet and they see the crashed ship and they find the bodies, and then they spend the second act arguing what to do about everything. To me, like the way time loops work is that, whatever. The way I expected this episode to go is that they try to take off and they crash and they become the dead people, right?
Hmm.
And then it actually becomes this sort of, lost ending where they're already dead, but they're not quite dead.
Yeah, and as soon as Mason, tries to get through to the captain that they're all dead, he's like, no, I don't accept that. And then as soon as he like decides not to accept that reality, that's whenever he causes it to start over from the beginning.
Right. The moral or whatever, the message of this episode is like, go gracefully into this good night, right?
Well, I mean, in the closing narration, Rod Serling references the Flying Dutchman. He basically
Right.
says that they're like a modern day Flying Dutchman. And I did do a little bit of, just a touch of research on that. The Flying Dutchman, it's this fabled ghost ship that's supposedly doomed to sail the oceans forever. And the oldest version of the legend dates back to the late 18th century. And it's often told as like a portent of doom. Like, other sailors who see the Flying Dutchman, they're doomed in one way or the other. And other versions of the legend introduce some sort of punishment where the crew of the ship had committed some sort of crime, and that's why they're doomed to sail, unable to land until they've paid their penance. Which I think that aspect of the legend is interesting relating to this, because we don't really see there's no hint of any sort of crime. Like, the best guess, I mean, there's no explanation whatsoever given to why they crashed, whether it was an accident or
Right.
there's like not in, and there's not even any discussion of any sort of malicious intent other than, his theory that it's, aliens causing hallucinations, but
Right.
that's mostly dismissed as, just a wild theory because he doesn't accept that they're dead.
Yeah. So I had to look up the Flying Dutchman as well because I had heard the term before, but I didn't really know the story of it. And the reason I grew up in Pennsylvania, and there was a theme park, Dorney Park, near us, and they had a roller coaster called the Flying Dutchman. So that's just how I knew the term. And the funny thing, talking about how it's like a cursed ship or whatever, that ride was kind of cursed. It was, so most roller coasters are, you got a string of cars that holds, 20, 30 people, and it goes around, and it's the only thing on at the time, or maybe they load up a second one or whatever, right? The Flying Dutchman was a series of little cars each one was separate, and it held 4 people. And so they would launch one with 4 people in it, and then, 20 seconds later they would launch another one, and they just spaced them out, but they were all on the ride at the same time. And there were some accidents. So that ride is not there anymore.
Sound too surprising.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it is interesting that his just like sheer force of will, his stubbornness is keeping him in this time loop because he refuses to accept the fact that they're dead. And I guess I can see both sides, right? Because you saw what the 2 other guys, like their afterlives looked great, right? Reunited with family, etc. But then at the same time, we aren't given an explanation as to how they died. And so I can see how the captain is like, but wait, that doesn't make any sense. We're not dead.
Yeah, and you bring him up. You made me realize something that I think is interesting that I haven't talked about yet. And that you mentioned that the other 2 crewmates have people waiting for them on Earth, but it's interesting because they actually make a point to mention that Carter, the one who spends most of his time kind of like loopy, almost like in a drug
Yeah.
haze, just like staring at his hands at one point. But they mentioned that he's got somebody waiting for him at home on Earth, his wife Mary, who is still alive. And whenever he goes back home as a ghost, he's not able to see Mary because she's still alive. He just sees her clothes and the note, the telegram.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
But
I did.
Mason, he has his wife and daughter waiting for him in the afterlife.
Because they died.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Because I didn't put that together when I was watching it. Because at that point I thought that was still hallucinations or whatever. I didn't realize what was going on.
Yeah, so it's interesting that they talk about Carter having somebody waiting for him on Earth, even though it's actually, in their situation, Mason is the one who has somebody who's actually waiting for him right now.
Yeah. And then they mentioned that Captain Ross didn't have anybody.
Right.
Is that so? Yeah. So that's why he's not interested in going to the afterlife.
Yeah, he doesn't strike me as like a mama's boy.
Yeah, right.
Going home, wanting to see his parents in the afterlife, and they don't say one way or the other, but it's somewhat implied, I think, especially because he's so unwilling to accept his death, that he probably doesn't have like a wife who had passed on earlier that would be waiting for him in the afterlife.
Right.
So going back to the Flying Dutchman, there is one other moment in this episode that I haven't talked about, and I think it actually could potentially be some sort of connection to the Flying Dutchman, because at one point Carter does pull a gun on the captain.
Yeah.
It's like an extremely brief moment, and they completely just they resolve it almost instantaneously. It's like
Yeah.
you don't. It's like he pulls the gun and he's like, "We're not going up," and Mason's like, "You don't want to do that," and he's like, "Okay."
Yeah. Yeah, it was weird how quickly that was resolved. To me, it was also kind of weird that they had guns, like that they didn't have phasers or laser zaps or something. Just seeing a Colt 45 in his hand was just kind of odd. Something you'd never want to fire if you're in a spaceship. Oh yeah, here it is. So I mentioned Star Trek before, and I took several notes relating to Star Trek. Like I thought Shatner would have been a good person to play the captain in this. Probably because he's captain of whatever. But then I thought before I got to the end and realized that they're all dead and all that stuff, I thought this had the bones to be a good Star Trek episode. We've seen stuff like this before. You go on a planet, weird stuff starts happening. They're seeing their families or dead families or whatever, and then the captain's got to go in and pull them out and save them. In Star Trek, it would have been the aliens with the hallucinations, right?
Yeah, and it reminds me, and I think I actually mentioned this on the first episode, like the episode with Picard where he lives the entire lifetime,
Right.
And in his own mind.
Yeah, that's a good. I haven't seen that one in a long time.
Yeah, and he keeps the flute at the end,
Right.
and still remembers
Yeah.
how to play the song. Yeah, I rewatched The Next Generation just a few years ago. I've realized that if I do all of the Star Trek time loop episodes in one season, that's going to be an extremely long season, because I think every series of Star Trek has had at least one time loop episode, and they all have the repetitions in them. So, each one will be several time loops within them.
Okay.
But that'll be fun too, because I'm a big Star Trek fan. I haven't watched too much of the new stuff, but I've watched all the ones. I don't think I caught the end of Voyager, but I watched the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
And then I circled back around and caught Enterprise. Several years later.
Yeah. I've seen the whole Next Gen, all 7 seasons, several times, and I watched Deep Space Nine when it was in its last couple of seasons. I caught all that stuff. Voyager I kind of gave up on when it was first airing, but now that it's on Netflix, actually it's leaving Netflix, so I got to find another way to watch it. But I'm going through that, and it's actually a lot better than I thought it would be. So that was good.
That's one that I do want to at some point circle back around on, because I watched it, whenever it was first airing, but I think like it switched stations, and so I couldn't keep up with it after that. And then,
Right.
I never circled back around to watch it on home video or on streaming yet.
Yeah, the new stuff's good though. Discovery and Picard, really good stuff.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things. I heard Discovery took a little bit to get on
It
its
did.
feet,
Yeah,
but I've heard later seasons are really good.
yeah.
I think about the only other note that I have about this episode is, the writer of this was Richard Matheson, and he wrote several Twilight Zone episodes. I think he was the one that wrote Nightmare at 20,000 Feet.
Oh, perfect.
It wasn't until later seasons like this one where he actually based the episodes on short stories that he had written previously. Like the first episodes that he started writing were all original for the Twilight Zone. And this one was one that was an adaptation of an earlier story, and it was originally published in March 1953 in an issue of Fantastic Story magazine. And I believe he follows pretty closely to his original short story. There's just like a handful of differences in it. But
Okay.
I don't think you mentioned it. It's like what did you think about the episode overall? Like how I know you mentioned that it took you a little while to figure it out, but did you like once you figured it out, did you think it was a decent episode or just like an okay episode?
I think it's pretty good. I think, like I said, the ending was a twist that I wasn't expecting, which is good. But I think they do the thing where, they kind of end it quickly, but then Rod Serling comes on and gives you the lowdown, which I don't know how I feel about that. Like I love some of his intro, and I love Rod Serling, but like it always, narration and explanation always seem a little like, okay, a little heavy-handed, So,
In the modern era, it's like lazy screenwriting, but at the time, it's like that's a lot of times that's just how it was done.
yeah.
And also, it's Rod Serling, so
Yeah, totally. The fact that you were just saying that the story was originally published in 1953 makes a lot more sense because, that was before the space program really even got started. And so that means that explains why they really, like, none of it makes any sense. None of the technology, none of the what was it? The theory of
circumnavigation.
Circumnavigation, yeah. Like, okay. So I would say it's a decent episode. It's not up and in my favorites, but
I think it
all
does
of it,
suffer a little bit from being one of the 1 hour episodes, because I do think that there's several scenes that feel like they're just filler.
yeah, totally.
Like the gun scene that we mentioned.
The gun scene, yeah.
It's like,
And
we need 15 seconds before the commercial. Let's have Carter draw a gun on him.
Let's have Jack Klugman flip switches for 28 seconds.
Although I do love that a lot of times he like flips switches, like in the beginning, like Mason is checking the atmosphere, and then he walks away, and then Klugman walks up behind him and he like flips a switch a couple times, like double checking it, because
Right.
that really fits with his character. And there's a lot of little things. I think this episode does hold up better with rewatches because there's a lot of subtle stuff. One other thing that you probably didn't notice is, and I went in a bit more detail into it in the last episode, but there are 53 repetitions of dialogue where they either repeat an entire phrase or they repeat a single word more than once. Usually like repeating their name over and over, or like, he says, we're going to do it over again and over again.
That was the line that I actually noted down. We're going to do it over again, or go over it again.
Yeah, and it's it's incredible that because the for the most part it's not it seems natural, at least natural for this period of television. Like it doesn't sound like they're doing these repetitions to make a point of it. It just sounds like that's how they're normally speaking.
Yeah, it doesn't. Like I didn't really notice it, so it didn't seem forced at all. Yeah.
The episode I think does hold up to repeat viewings, especially with knowing the twist and seeing how they do clue you in a little bit
Yeah.
early on in the episodes. So let me ask you, like, since you said that you didn't know, were you kind of going along with some of their theories, like, or did you, whenever they brought up a theory, like, did you say, were you along with the characters, like, yeah, that seems like a possibility, or like, no, that just sounds ridiculous. It's probably like, what was your best guess of what was going on in the episode as it was playing out?
I was actually along for the ride with their theories. I was like, oh yeah, sure, alien hallucinations. That seems plausible. And whatever, I forget what the other theories were, but yeah, I wasn't. I really had no clue, and I knew like because we're doing this show, I knew there was going to be a time loop involved. But like I said earlier, I thought they were going to crash and become the previous people in the time loop. So yeah, it was kind of. I think you're right. I think that the clues were there if you go and rewatch it, like The Sixth Sense or whatever. But yeah, I didn't pick up on
I think my favorite clue is like, after they walk out of the ship having seen their own dead bodies, and Carter says, "We're dead," and that he just says those two
right.
lines. That's the kind of the only thing that he says, and it's like, on a first viewing, that's very like he just saw his own dead body, but then on a second time viewing, it's like they are dead.
Yeah, right. It was an interesting way they phrased it,
Mm.
but because this is an old TV show, like you're just used to people saying things in weird ways because it's 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, 60 years ago.
Oh yeah, and the 90s was just, 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man.
Well, I think that's about all the notes that I have for this time. I think it's worked out well doing it this way. I've gotten to talk a lot about this episode in several different ways, and it's been interesting to get different people's perspectives. I'm glad that, it seems like everybody's at least enjoyed the episode to a certain extent, and I've definitely really appreciated the episode, uh, even on multiple viewings. But was there anything else that you wanted to say about this episode or the Twilight Zone in general, or any other time loop movies or shows?
Well, I think we covered all the time loop shows that I can think of at the beginning. Um, Groundhog Day, just almost a perfect movie.
Yeah.
But then I'm sure since you covered it, you went into the background of all that stuff and how crazy it was to make it and how they changed everything while they were making it. So that's just a great story. Yeah. No, I think that's good.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed having you on. But for everybody listening to this, why don't you go ahead and take a minute and plug in any of your projects if anybody else wants to listen to more of you on the internet.
Okay, sure, why not? So I have been the movies by minutes that I've been doing are Airplane Minute and Top Secret Minute, and we're hopefully going to continue doing the Zucker Brothers movies with Naked Gun, etc. I also did Office Space Minute, and my current project is Sequel Harder, where we talk about good movies and their awful sequels. That I think we've been recording our 4th season now. And and I also work with Heidi Bennett. As people may know her, she did Cabin Minute Cast and Spinal Tap Minute. and we have she has a podcast called Vibrant Visionaries, which I edit for her, and we have a YouTube channel called Vibrant Visionaries, where it's interviews with creative people. It's cooking videos, how to make different things, and fun stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I've got going on.
As always, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me at flightstylesandmovienights.com. You can find me on Twitter at Bubbawheat. You can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, on Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else where you listen to podcasts. We have a Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group, where you can join to discuss episodes as they come out, or discuss time loop movies or TV shows in general. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, I'd appreciate it if you leave us a rating and a review to help grow this show and get it out to even more listeners. And until next time, I will still be right here, trapped in the Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow. Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow. Another dimension. Self.
Submitted for your
Shadow. The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone. That the movements they make and the words they speak have all been made and spoken countless times before, and will be made and spoken countless times again, perhaps even unto eternity. Picture of a latter-day Flying Dutchman sailing into the Twilight Zone.